Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Dicey Sedgwick. Or should I say, Fabulous Folklore Presents? Because in this sixth interview based episode, I'm going to be chatting with Ed Karshner about all things to do with Appalachian folklore, including ghosts and witches, and I rather think you'll enjoy this episode if you like the kind of content I normally do. Now, Ed Karshner grew up in southeast Appalachia, Ohio. He did a PhD in rhetoric and philosophy, and his primary research interest was how landscape influences folk ideologies, and he has also worked with the Dene people, or Navajo, as well. Now, as an associate professor of English at Robert Morris University, he researches, teaches, and writes about Appalachian folklore, magic, and mysticism. All good things, I think you'll agree. He's also the folklorist columnist for the online magazine Reckon Review, and I'm pleased to welcome him here to the podcast. So, without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. So, welcome to Fabulous Folklore Presents.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know you've been a listener for a while, so this is kind of cool getting someone on who's like, I know what you do.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, but it was, I was in my academic career, I had kind of hit a really frustrating spot, and then that's when I discovered Fabulous Folklore. And so you really kind of made me see the importance of sort of like a popular folklore, like doing folklore for regular people as opposed to, the academia. And so because of you, I got the sweet gig at Reckon Review as their folklore columnist, and I've been a lot happier. So to be on the podcast is just fantastic. I'm fanboying out. So.
Awesome. Always good to hear. Obviously, like, we'll just get into the interview because otherwise we'll just be chatting and everyone watching will be like, because that can happen sometimes. So obviously I said in the interview how you live in I'm gonna say this wrong, Appalachia.
Appalachia. Yeah.
Appalachia. I told you I'd get it wrong.
Well, so, like they say, throw an Appalachia.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'll try
Yeah.
and remember it that way. And I think because I remember I had to ask you where that was,
Hmm.
and this huge area that it takes up in. 'Cause I think outside of America, like, well, the states, we kind of don't necessarily have that good a grasp of the geography, I think, unless someone's actually visited. So, how would you describe the region for anyone who's never been?
Yeah, well, and that's and there's a lot of controversy about that as well, even within Appalachia studies. But generally, when you talk about the Appalachian region, so it's you've got the can kind of picture like the go inland from the east coast of the United States, and so from like southern New York State, then all the way down through western Pennsylvania, and then into West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, western North and South Carolina, and then North Georgia, and actually all the way over into northern Alabama. So the Appalachian region is makes up 13 states, 420 counties, and has 25.7 million people. So it's a pretty good sized region, but generally, but even like within the popular imagination, when people think of Appalachia, they're usually thinking of well, and I'm from Ohio, Appalachia, Ohio. So, but most people think of Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, and I don't know, kind of the you get into like Western North Carolina has a lot of like great literature there too. So it's a vast region, and it really is with a lot of similarities, but then also substantial differences. But we were just even talking about like Appalachia versus Appalachia, and even that there's a kind of a cutoff where you sort of get into the northern parts of Appalachia. People start, the pronunciation shifts. The dialect is a little bit different, but yeah, but generally that's what we're talking about. That eastern, this big swath on the kind of inland from into the mountains there on the east coast of the United States.
So how do people kind of sort of see it then? Because I know obviously I think people kind of have their images of what it's like on the West Coast, for example, and obviously I
Mm-hmm.
think people kind of conceptualize like the South a particular way. So how do people conceptualize that region, and then how does that bleed into sort of the folklore?
Well, I mean, I guess by people you mean like outsiders, sort of, or like the like a general kind of.
What would be the difference between outsiders and people who are from the
Oh,
area?
well, I think and again, just as the caveat, I'm going to, I've talked about this when I was at Berea College. Appalachia it's a region, it's a people, but it's also a construct. And so, a lot of like when people talk about, well, what is Appalachian culture? You're really talking about something that's constructed and has been constructed over time. So just as a caveat, I'll be filtering my perspective through growing up in the Appalachia, that eastern southeastern Appalachia, Ohio. But inside Appalachians themselves, we there's and even this will as we laughed about this, the idea of telling a story versus backing into it, but within Appalachia, I mean, if you're going to be, there's a pride. There's a pride about being there. There's an interesting. There used to be an interesting conflict between people who had this idea of how long have you been there, right? And so, like I can say, well, my fifth great grandfather settled in Hocking County in 1792, or my mom's people had settled in Western Virginia in 1780. And so that gives you that used to kind of give you a little bit of cachet, right? To be able to say, oh, well, we've always been here, even though we hadn't, right? Because Native Americans have been there first. But then there's also but recently too, there's been this sort of discussion about the people who have come in as immigrants, and this is even like into the early 20s, there was this big influx of Italian and Polish, Middle Eastern people, and Welsh. I mean, obviously to work in the coal mines. But there's a great book that just came out. I think it was last spring, but it's called Another Appalachia, and it's written by she's Nima Avasia, and she was born in West Virginia, but her family is from India. And so he had worked he was the company doctor for a chemical company, but she's got this really interesting experience. And I think what's interesting about that is because so many cultures come into Appalachia, and this gets to that idea of folklore, that tradition is very fluid. And I think then that's just like in any type of folklore, because I know on folklore Twitter, there's a lot of this discussion about like, well, you want to start getting a little wary when somebody starts talking about, no, we want a pure Anglo-Saxon folklore, that icky stuff. It's the same thing I think with Appalachian folklore and cultures. When someone says, no, we want a pure tradition, or this isn't, these people don't have a say. That's really when you have to start wondering and worrying, because Appalachia is so fluid, and you've got primarily European, German, Scotch, Irish, English, Welsh, Norwegian, Scandinavian countries. All of these people found their way in there, but there were already Native Americans there. A big, especially you get up into like into the sort of the Western Carolinas, a large African influence, because that's where when slaves would run away, and they could, and there, and this is kind of, not everyone was like this, but there was a certain freedom there, to a place to hide. You could go hide in the mountains, and so that this rich African tradition also feeds into it. The banjo is an African musical instrument, and some of the really old timers who play, they call it a claw hammer style. That's an African style of playing the banjo. So it's very fluid. It's a huge mix of stuff. And so I think, so when so on the inside, I think that there is kind of an acknowledgement of that. You get into it, but then as maybe we can talk about this later, but from the outside though, there's a tendency to want to make it monolithic. And that's when and also to demean it, because that's the thing too. Appalachia has always been, it's some scholars, it's America's third world. It's an extraction economy. The rich people come in and they take, the people, the lumber, the water, the natural gas, the coal, and then just kind of leave this, a kind of a wasteland and behind. But so there's a weird attitude on the outside where the people were seen as ignorant, violent. It's usually, and we had talked about this, it's the same everywhere. You get like the big things, oversexed, violent, and stupid, right? And even the idea that and this is an idea that really is getting pushed back against heavily, and I'm glad, the idea that Appalachia is always rural, white, and male, right? Because that's, the largest city in Appalachia is Pittsburgh. And so, and Pittsburgh is very cosmopolitan. Asheville is it's very cosmopolitan, and all these colleges in these places. And so this idea that it's sort of intellectually bankrupt or artistically bankrupt is just not true. So to kind of pull all that together, I think that from the inside, there is a pride, and there's also this acknowledgement of this fluidity. And Leonard Roberts is a folklore that I was working with in Berea, or he's dead, but I was working with his material in Berea. But he talks about this accumulation of layers, and that's really what you see in Appalachian folklore. You can kind of start to really peel that back and really look at all these different ways that the tradition has and the folklore has evolved. So.
I'm resisting the urge as a Gothic scholar to go, so it's a palimpsest then.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
We know how much I love jargon. So you mentioned the work you'd been doing at Berea College. So what exactly did that involve?
Well, it was a great opportunity. So Berea College, I call it the Oz of Appalachia because it's where all the wizards put their information. So they have a fantastic special collections and archives there. And so I applied for and got a 2-week fellowship to study in the archives. And I worked with they've got bell hook stuff. They've got a lot of Appalachian scholars have given their materials to Berea College. But I was working with there's a Kentucky folklorist named Leonard Roberts, and he was active from the like mid 1950s, and then he died in an automobile accident in 1983. So like about 30 years, he collected in the mountains. And what he did, what was interesting too, was that he taught at different universities around the Kentucky and Western Virginia area. And so he would have his students collect folklore from their grandparents and their great grandparents. And so all of that is just in these massive boxes and folders in Berea. So I spent 2 weeks just going through that material, Leonard Roberts' works. But what I was working on, and we had talked about this earlier, but I was trying to, my project was to try to piece out or try to, again, peel back those layers to come to an Appalachian hauntology. Because I'm fascinated with and I'm fascinated with hauntology for the reason that when I first started, when I kind of had a weird trajectory in my career where I've done everybody's folklore but my own, and then it's only been within the last like maybe 10 years that I actually started to really kind of come back to my own folklore. But one of the first things that it was my friend Sunny Dooley. She's a Navajo storyteller, and she had said, you write a lot about us. I was doing Navajo studies at the time, and she said, and there are mistakes that people make writing about a culture from the outside. And she said, and she meant this to be, helpful. And she said, you should look at how other people write about your culture, how they write about Appalachia. And so I went and I thought, that's not a bad idea, right? So I went and looked at those ideas. And one of the first things that I noticed was this idea of fatalism. And, this idea that Appalachians are gloomy and fatalistic, and there's this sort of weird helplessness. And I thought, I never saw that. I mean, I always saw, and I've even heard other Appalachian scholars say that too, that, it's like, well, there's this fatalism. I think we've just kind of accepted that. But I just didn't see that. I didn't, this idea that there's kind of there's a pragmatism, right? That's, this idea that, well, the good times will eventually end, but that's not fatalistic. That's true. Things kind of change. But I think what I saw was this idea that there wasn't this obsession with endings. It was this acknowledgement of endings, but then there was always the idea that, well, something else will happen after that. So this idea. So I got interested in the idea of time, and so I started to look at the idea of like. So I looked at this idea of fatalism. This idea that it's always already, right? That it's already been determined, and we just kind of have to sit and wait for it to happen to us. Which is, I did not see that in Appalachian culture. I didn't see this passive quietism. So then I thought, okay, well, I'll look at nostalgia, because maybe that's because Appalachians are obsessed with the past. I mean, with stories and ancestors. Again, going back, how long have your people been here? What did they do? And so I thought, okay, well then nostalgia, but then that idea ties into the already was. And so there's just kind of like a resting on your laurels kind of a thing, which I didn't see that either. So that was when I kind of stumbled onto this idea of hauntology. And it was actually through the Hookland stuff that David Southwell does. So I really started to look at that, and I thought, well, there's an idea, right? This idea of hauntology where there's an acknowledgement of the present. There's this sort of looking into the future or what might happen next. But then there's this acknowledgement of this haunting. There's these the past is always present kind of an idea. So that was when, and I think you were like, we had talked about, you were on that thing where then, so I was like going off on that. And then David Southwell's like, no, and that everybody's hauntology is different. And so that was my project. Well, what is an Appalachian hauntology? How is that different than all of these other different, David's idea of hauntology or Mark Fisher's idea or Derrida's idea? And then what does that look like in terms of how you sort of negotiate this idea of time and existence? And so that was what my project was really about. And what made Robert's material so fascinating was it is from the 50s. Like he did it, like the big chunk of his collecting was from the 50s to the 70s. And so that was like before this mass media contamination where you started to kind of get it canonized or this is what a jacktail is. But instead you can read all of these different variations of a jacktail, and they're all localized and they're all unique to families. And so you really get that big sense of all the variants. In folklore we get obsessed. We variants are exciting, right? All those different versions and how they speak to where they're from. And so that's what I was doing with the Roberts collection was trying to nail down this idea of being haunted in time in Appalachia. And that's what I was working on.
So is that how you would define hauntology? Because it's one of those words again where I'm like, it gets tossed about quite a bit by people, and I'm not even 100% sure where I sit on it. So did you come up with your own definition that works for you, or?
Yeah, I like Derrida's very, he was the first one or at least generally people like say, well, Derrida was the first one to use that kind of pun. And so what he meant was to exist is to be haunted. And then he doesn't really, talk much about then, or he does, but who really understands what Derrida's talking about, right? So, but I like the idea. So I like the idea of him using the Hamlet scene, Hamlet's father, Hamlet's like, what are you doing here? And the ghost says, I'm here to remind you of your almost blunted purpose. And so that idea of Derrida's has really stuck with me. This idea that there is, again, because this fits into how I see my Appalachia. It's very purposeful. It's very intentional. And so I think that there is this, with anyone really, that we tend to get bogged down. And I like Fisher's idea of the past isn't something that we drag around, but kind of something that propels us forward. That there's that promised that kind of lost promise, but not really, because we're not there yet. So we're not in hover cars yet, like in Blade Runner, but maybe, but so I like that. So this idea that the past is something that we continually return to and haunts us in the sense to remind us that, there is a purpose coming down the road. And so that's what, and that's kind of what centers us now to help us make decisions. And I like that, and I think Fisher uses that concept of weird, that you get in like, Norse, Anglo-Saxon mythology, folklore, and that idea of weird as being the past tense. It means was, but it also carries with it this idea of like a debt. So we owe, and that's very Appalachian. All of these, my great grandparents, they did all of these things to get me to where I am. And so it's not just something that happened in the past. Now I owe them, and what I owe them is a future for, my kids, or, or a lot of the young Appalachian students who I work with. I pay my debt to my ancestors or the past by helping the future. And so to me, that's what hauntology means, is this incorporation of this really porous idea of time, and how it all sort of collapses in on us at any one point in time, and how we can make use of our history and our purpose to propel us forward to really a preferred outcome, like something better than just like kind of waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I like the idea of to be is to be haunted, to always have something from the past whispering to us, you can do better, or there's something that you need to be doing.
So I'm just thinking of all those awful, like, motivational sort of memes that you could get out of that. That'll keep me occupied for the weekend.
Yeah.
I think the thing that sort of, I know because you were sending sort of bits that you'd found in the archives when you were looking at them and so on, and I think it was interesting, that idea of variation of stories, because one of the things I always noticed, particularly on Twitter, when you're sharing a piece of folklore, you've only got 280 characters or less by the time you take the hashtag out. And you would often share it and someone would go, oh, that's not the version of that story I've heard. And you're like, that's because obviously these stories do sometimes have local variants, or sometimes it's just the fact that somebody's clearly misheard it at some point and they've then passed on the slightly wonky version rather than, and so on. So do you find that it's a combination of just people having their own version, or is it a combination of kind of someone's passed on the misinformation version? So it's kind of like the Mandela effect, but in folklore.
Yeah, that's because one of the things that I noticed, there's a Jack tale called Sop Doll, and it's a classic haunted house story. Jack is out of work, he's meandering around, and he comes upon this like a grist mill, and no one will work there, and because every time somebody works there, they're dead by morning. It's like, when I teach this in class, we read Beowulf, the first half of Beowulf, and then we read Sopdal, because it's Jack as Beowulf, right? Almost. So Jack says, Jack doesn't have anything to lose, and so he tells the mill keeper, he's like, well, I'll run your mill for you. And the mill keeper's like, well, you'll be dead by morning. And Jack's like, well, we'll see, right? I mean, and that's kind, and again, that's not fatalistic, right? He's just like, well, but all right. And he's just like, I don't know, we'll see. We'll see how this works out. So Jack is every bit like that. So right away, Jack is a character completely smashes this idea that of fatalism. So Jack does so long story short, Jack does a good turn for this old man. Jack is getting ready to close the mill down. Old man shows up and says, I need this flour, or I need some flour ground up. And Jack says, well, I'm closing up, but sure, I'll help you out. So he helps out the old guy. And so the old guy gives him a silver knife. And so now there you have this magical instrument, right? So Jack goes in that night and he's cooking his meal, and these black cats start coming in. And so every time the cat starts to put its paw in his food, he slaps the cat's foot and he says Sopdal. And no one really knows it, even no one knows what he means by that, in all the literature. Eventually he cuts the cat's paw off. And then all the other cats kind of scramble. So the next morning, the mill owner checks to see how to get Jack's dead body out of the mill, and Jack is up, at work, and Jack says, well, all this stuff happened, and I cut the cat's foot off, and blah blah blah, and long story. So as it wraps up, they go back to the mill owner's house and find that his wife is still in bed sick because her hand is missing. So she had been turning herself, and so that's a classic. But when I was going through the Roberts collection, you find that variation of Sopdal and all these, except it's always like, well, this happened to my Uncle Ted, right? Or this happened just right down the road at the that this house, that's this abandoned house at the crossroads. So the variation is you take Jack out of it, you make it local, and maybe even put like your ancestor into that place. Now, does that mean that they're lying, or because that none of that matters? But I think that but your point is, I think that I think folklore, as folklorists, and like you said, because you run into this too, we're okay with those differences, to say like, oh, well, that's interesting that you have that same story, except it was your Uncle Ted instead of Jack. That's fascinating. But the person whose Uncle's Ted, well, they'll get mad about that, because it's like, no, that really happened. That's been in my family for hundreds of years, But I think what's important about that, though, is again, it's like the story was important enough to make personal. And I think, and so with what folklore does, and I know that like Mark Norman is big on this, is like really using folklore as a way to kind of really unearth that creative humanity that we have. And so it's not that those people are lying. It's not that your grandparents lied to you about your great uncle Ted in the haunted house. It's just that that story was important enough that it needed to be ingrained. And then the next question is like we were talking about before. Well, what's the why to that? Why was that important? So then that's when you get into the really cool stuff. How is the Uncle Ted story different from the Jack story? What stayed in, what was taken out, and what was added? And then you can really start to get a sense of what a community values, what a family values. And that's the real, this idea of truth. I just think that it's incredibly overrated, right? We should be more interested, at least I'm more interested in making sense of this stuff as about, calling somebody a liar or, I think it's fun to just to kind of indulge in those what ifs and whys.
I think it's really interesting because just sort of hearing that sort of brief sort of version of that story obviously made me think of the stories that you get in the British Isles, where people believed that witches could turn into hares, and
Yes.
you would then obviously have sort of a farmer might sort of shoot a hare that's running across his land, or because for some reason, obviously, I can understand why the witches would try and steal like milk and butter in the form of a hare, which to my mind doesn't seem the most practical, but that's the story. And then he injures the hare in some way, and then the old woman or his neighbor then has a corresponding injury. And what's really interesting is the number of the stories where he's then like, you can't come around my property anymore because I'm onto you, and you end up with this weird sort of truce. So I love the fact that obviously that kind of story has possibly then just traveled with whoever's taken that story
Mm-hmm.
with them and is then been reconfigured to suit its new location. And I think that's where, oh, I've forgotten who I was talking about this with the other day. The fact that a lot of the time when you look at folklore, you realize how similar people are and how similar people's preoccupations are, even if on the, like all the surface stuff, like the decoration might be a bit different, but like the underlying structure is very similar. And you do just sort of think that, to me, that's why it's worth preserving stuff, to sort of see that actually what you might think is a little bit eccentric, actually everybody does. And then you go, oh, okay, then it's not just you.
Yeah, that's funny because I mean we'll talk about witches later, but it's the same thing. It's like the witches as shapeshifters, the obsession with butter and milk. That's funny because it's the same thing in the Roberts collection. But I think, well, when I was at Kentucky, I took a picture of like an interview that Roberts and I sent it to you, where he talked about just like what you said, this idea that when you're studying folklore, to not get tripped up on like you said, all the kind of the decorations, but really kind of get down to it, to find that common story of humanity, like those concerns and those worries. And because and I think that, again, cultural appropriation and all of those, these are conversations that we need to have, but I also don't think that that means we shouldn't be really looking seriously at other people's. I mean, don't be an expert. I mean, I never considered myself an expert on like Navajo or Dene metaphysics, but it was worth it to kind of really get a sense of their worldview, their folk metaphysics, and how that worked, and then how I saw bits and pieces of that start to feed in. Like, so my friend Sunny and I, we talk a lot about the differences between like storytelling between like in her tradition and then in the Appalachian tradition. And I have an interview with her coming out next week in Reckon Review, where she kind of says it's just like, well, we're kind of talking about two different things here, and you are, but at the same time, there are these similarities, especially with this idea of stories as being transformative. That once you start to get past the entertainment value and start to ask why, and like we were talking about how the story changes in different contexts, I think that you really start to get at that essential human story that Roberts was talking about.
And I think story really, what I find hilarious, because obviously like in my day job when I'm not sort of podcasting and whatnot, one of the things I teach is advertising, and obviously one of the huge underpinning things that a lot of people are talking about in advertising and have for the last few years is, oh, it's all about the story. What story can you tell someone? Because if I were to just simply talk about a new car and be like, oh, it's got this many miles to the gallon, or blah de blah, and come out, you can tell I don't drive, can't you? Come out with a whole load of flashy whiz bang stuff that the car has. An actual petrol head would be like, wow, yeah, and like that would sell them. But most people would just be like,
Hmm.
is it going to get me to work on time? And you have to, and I think that's where it's really funny, because certain brands are really good at then telling that story that you can then situate yourself in. And I feel like while folklore, you can't always necessarily situate yourself in some of the stories because we're so far removed from the context. I think a lot of the emotion that drives those stories, like everybody's been jealous, everybody's been heartbroken, everybody's been annoyed, everyone's been hopeful that these magic beans they've brought home from the market are going to do something useful for them. And I think that it does kind of play testament to that kind of human condition that actually, yeah, I mean, most people's mistakes aren't going to be quite as impressive as some of the ones that you find in folklore or fairy tales, but you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
it is that sort of the bridge between like where I am and where you are kind of thing. And I think that that's um something that we should possibly acknowledge about folklore a little bit more, rather than
Mm.
it sort of descending into sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say sort of some of the the realm that you get into where people are then sharing bits from, say, a role playing game as actual folklore.
Mm.
So I think it's just, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that. I think it's just trying to kind of recognize sort of how people are connecting with it and why.
Yeah, that's we had a conversation yesterday, Alex and I, about the difference between like a say a because when you're a folklorist, right, this is the kind of conversations you have with an 11-year-old. The difference between like a narrative and a story. And we were actually talking about advertising for the same reason. This idea that, well, you're trying with when you tell a narrative, it's very Aristotelian, right? This idea like people will believe something, Aristotle said, if you narrate it, like if it's told as a story. So, but you're trying to get somebody to do something particular, right? So it's like you said, you're going to buy this car because you'll be flashy and you live in this big house. That's the commercials. I don't know if you guys have those same commercials over in the UK, but the people drive their big fancy car up to their big fancy house on top of a hill, and it's all lights and the valley below with all the lights and everything. It's like, wow, my life can be like that if only I had a Tesla. And so, but that's a narrative. And I think this is where my friend Sunny gets hung up, is she'll look at that and she'll say, well, see, that's an Anglo way of telling a story. But even I think though, I think that, like I said, that's a narrative. A story though opens up for me when I think of the difference between a story and a narrative. A narrative wants to take you to a particular outcome. That's a one-way street. I'm going to take you from point A to point B, and I'm going to sell that narrative as a commodity. It's something that I can commodify. So I'm getting very Marxist. And so, but then a story though opens up infinite possibilities within that story, and it's meant to a story is meant to crack open your agency so that where it becomes participatory that way. So it's like we'll tell the story of Jack and the mill, and then afterwards, it kind of works on you, and it becomes a way then that it becomes a filter that you see the world through, like you were saying, like with the beans and stuff, or a way to like kind of judge your, to adjust your action. And and there's a lot, if you look at the text of that Jack story, there's a lot that goes on, and including like and which is similar to like what Beowulf does. It's this idea of first off taking on an impossible task, thinking that you have a good chance of having a better outcome than everybody else that's come before you, and then kind of making a deal with yourself. I love that Beowulf idea where that moment where he decides, you know, he first he boasts. I mean, he's drunk and he's like, well, if Beowulf doesn't have a sword, or if Grendel doesn't have a sword, well, neither do I, and so I will fight him, barehanded. But then they're all asleep, and then Grendel's meandering around, and Beowulf's like, oh man, because I'm really, then he's confronted with this choice. I either have to, live up to the boast or always be a coward. Like, you can still kill Grendel with a sword, but then he'll be a coward and a liar. And so Beowulf's like, well, I guess, I'm gonna have to just do it barehanded, even though I don't want to, And so there's that kind of thought process then that starts to become internalized, and then it becomes almost like an ethics, so a story will eventually become uh, the germ for like a personal sense of ethics that you get from those stories, in which case then anything can become a story. That the car commercial, I guess, theoretically could become a story if you start to internalize it to make changes. But you're talking about like those cultures becoming a bridge. The most exciting moment that I've, well, say top 5 exciting moments of folklore was I was in China, and we had gone to what was it called, the Wild Goose Pagoda, I think. But it was where there was this Buddhist monk who was Chinese, and so they weren't, the Chinese had started to not really sure what Buddhism was supposed to look like. So he goes on this epic adventure, and that's like with the Monkey King and all of that stuff. And so he was a historical figure. A lot of the stuff that has grown up around him is mythology and folklore. But the pagoda where he brought back all of these primary Buddhist texts is still there, and all of the books that he brought back are still there. So you go into the library room, and there are all these paintings on the wall that tell a story. And so I was there with I was paired with a Chinese student, and I was tutoring her in English, and she was tutoring me in Mandarin. So we go into that big library and all the paintings. And I said, what's all this stuff? And she's like, oh, well, this is the story of Tripitaka. And she's like, so when he was a little boy, he was born, but his parents couldn't afford to take care of him. But his mother knew that every day all of these monks went and hung out down by the river. So she put him in a basket and put him in the river so that he would float down. And then he was adopted by these monks. And then he goes on this adventure to find these sacred texts. I was like, I know that story. That's Moses, right? And so there's this moment, it's like I'm hearing the Chinese version of Moses, and it's not, and again, it's not that idea. It's like, well, they stole it from Mesopotamia, because I'm standing in the library of the books that the historical guy brought back. So it's that kind of moment where you realize that the world is huge. Cultures are vastly different, but sometimes our stories start to overlap. And that's like you said, that's that bridge, that's that common place. That's why folklore, I think, is so important.
I think that's where, as much as I might sometimes come across like a bit of a skeptic, I really love the idea that you sort of go, but it could also be true. And I'm just thinking of the fact that I've got a book that I'm reading about myths about the Pleiades, written by Munya Andrews, and it's all about how there's these different myths of the Pleiades, like all over the world, in cultures that would never have had any contact with each other. So it's almost like they've got very similar stories, but there's no kind of obvious point of intersection where somebody would have orally passed the story on to someone. So then you start thinking, well, if they all kind of appear in different places, is there actually something behind them? And I think that it's that not knowing that kind of almost makes them a little bit more magical. And I think that's where, on one hand, you can look at folklore and kind of scoff at, like, oh my God, people used to believe this stuff. But then other times you're like, but
right,
like, who's to say? And I always quite like that. And I think that's where, when I mentioned sort of Gothic studies before, I love the way it kind of ever so slightly sneaks into work, like M.R. James and so on. This idea that you could just find like a whistle on the beach, and I would 100% blow that whistle. I mean, that's the kind of person I am. But it's just that idea that and this is where these stories, I think, in a way, sort of encapsulate that, where like two people have had like almost the same idea at the same time. Well, where did the idea come from? So I always sort of think that that's kind of a way of sort of sneaking magic back into a world that maybe thinks it doesn't need it anymore.
Possibly. Yeah, and I think, and the way that there's, the way that it continues to come up, and I think this is where I try to be less snotty and think about, like like you said, like with M.R. James, right? It's like our literature becomes an expansion of folklore in a lot of ways. And I was thinking of my friend Megan Lucas, who she's a novelist from Western North Carolina, and she just had a short story come out in a crime anthology. And so it's this dirty crime thing about this woman who, she's, may or may not be a prostitute, and so, but she starts finding gold coins and dead animals, and the title of it's called Picking the Carcass. She goes out and kills her, like, she starts finding like roadkill, and so as she's moving them, gold coins start to fall out of these carcasses. And it's, you wind up with kind of like this, at the end of the story, you wind up with kind of a crimey kind of ending. But it's all of that stuff in the middle where, like you said, it's this woman who is starting to find, who's in a kind of a really desperate situation, but starts to, like what you're saying, she starts thinking, well, maybe this is magical, right? Because all of the, every time I find a dead animal, there are a bunch of gold coins inside the animal. And so the way that we can start to think about, like, again, like folklore as a, re-enchantment, or and I think that that's when, we tend to get so literal minded in our own, in our modern world. We're too smart for that, right? We're too smart, we're too cultured, we're too scientific, we're too advanced, whatever. But there is that part of us, I think, that we all, every one of us, every single human being has that curiosity and that desire to know, well, maybe, at that moment that you wake up in the middle of the night and you're just like, well, maybe there is something in that corner, or we, and no matter who you are, no matter how scientific you are, there's always that little bit in us that's looking for that magic. And then that comes out in our literature, I think, as we progress.
I think there are obviously sort of some cultures where obviously there'd be something go, well, of course we know. I think we're sort of slowly catching up with that a little bit. But I think that neatly takes us on to, if we're going to talk about sort of magic as it appears in folklore, how magic and witches obviously work together. Now obviously I think it's probably fair to say that I'm always quite interested in stories of historical witches, in that sense of a lot of the things they get accused of, you can tell that it's probably been fluffed up, shall we say, to serve an agenda. And I think that at the same time that goes the other way as well, because obviously when you look at the work of Margaret Murray, I think that has obviously got a lot to answer for. But so it's quite interesting to think how those kind of stories appear in your region. Obviously, bearing in mind people would have brought things from Europe,
Mm-hmm.
how they then kind of take on a life of their own when they're then not in that sort of what's the word I'm looking for? They're not in that kind of sort of container, as it were.
Mm. Yeah, and so when I started to look at the witch lore with it, so the stuff that I'll talk about is from the Leonard archive, or Leonard Roberts archives. But when I started to look at that, I think that, like you said, the idea of historical witches. Now, again, with all of these stories, they'll all say the same thing. It's like, well, this happened to my uncle, or this is. I've got a story here called Aunt Jenny's Witch, and this is about the person who told the story was telling it about their Aunt Jenny. But one of the first things that I noticed about Appalachian uh witchcraft, like when you really start to kind of like look at it as a, it's and I think too, I spend so much time just like going through books and then like trying to teach it and being very linear about it, to be kind of tossed into a box of that just called witch lore and to be completely immersed in it. You start to see things that you don't see when you're just like looking at one book at a time. But I found it interesting that all of the witches are always women, and I mean that's. But then this side was new to me. The idea of a witch doctor, somebody who's sort of like the counter witch, and that was always a male character. So something would be happening that was weird. You think that you're being witched, well, you have to go find a witch doctor, and this man would come and kind of assess everything. But we kind of talked about this already. In Appalachia, there's a huge tradition about shape shifting. So the witch will turn into a cat or a rattlesnake or a dog. One of the big ones was always a sow to turn it. So you're talking about the hare, and in Appalachia it will be a pig. So, but it was always the same kind of thing. Then you have to, they would and this was what was interesting. It depends. So the story had two different stories would take it in different directions. So you have this pig that's been trying to kill your kid, right? And so then you shoot the pig, but then your mother-in-law dies, and so it's like, well, my mother-in-law had sort of thrown her consciousness into that pig. But then you have stories like the Jack Tale with Sopdal, where the like somebody will throw hot water on the pig, and then the pig runs off, but then they find out then their aunt or a neighbor then is all scalded, and that's like, so then it was actually like physically transforming, like almost like a werewolf, right? Where the person wakes up the next day with the same wounds as the wolf. So shape shifting was one of the ways. And then you did the hag ridden stuff. That's a huge one too, to be this idea that the witches will ride you to death. And so just real quick, here's so This is called Aunt Jenny's Witch, and this is from 1959. So even into 1959, this stuff was still relevant. It says, this happened many years ago when my Aunt Jenny was about 14 years old. She suddenly started losing weight so fast the family was worried about her and tried to find out what was wrong, but they couldn't. She couldn't tell them. When her father took over the questioning, the girl broke down and told them that she wasn't getting any sleep at all because each night a witch was riding her from Grand, where they lived, to Petacalas, Kentucky, a distance of about 30 miles. They started sitting up with her, but it didn't do any good. Each night she carried the witch from Graham to Petacalas, and then she got thinner and thinner until they knew that she couldn't live. So they went to a man who knew about charms, and then they get it taken care of. But here I think there too, this idea that she's not being, they're sitting up with her though, so she's not being physically turned into a horse in this story. It's more like the witch is able to kind of pull her consciousness out and put it into a horse. But then there were actual other stories where people were transformed, and then those were really cool because you had the witch bridle, where the witch had this magical bridle that she could slip onto a guy, and then he would actually turn into a horse, and then she would literally ride him all night. The way to break that curse was to set fire to the bridle. So that was a cool story. But then you had mentioned too, then what's the most horrible thing that witches do generally? I mean, when they're not riding people to death, is that they're witching milk. They're causing milk and butter to go bad, or stealing it. And so I thought that was interesting.
Somebody did explain that the other day on Twitter, and I can't remember what the person said, if it was because they were actually like almost attacking your method of production, sort of thing. So you would obviously producing this stuff either A, to consume, or B, to sell. And that they would obviously be making it go bad, obviously would sort of be their way of kind of, I suppose, like industrial sabotage. Whereas if they're stealing it, then I think that speaks to a class issue, more than anything else. Or perhaps that they just don't have the means to make it themselves. But it is quite interesting how that's the bit of that story that's moved.
Yeah, well, the idea of production is interesting. There was one story that I really liked where so everybody's milk goes bad, and then they can't make milk or butter. But then there's this one old lady who keeps coming into town. She's got all this milk to sell, and so everybody kind of gets suspicious. Like, why does she have? So one night, a guy sneaks up to her house and looks through the keyhole, and she's milking a dish rag and making milk out of the dish rag. And that's how she had too much milk, because she had this magic dish rag.
Wow. Oh God. Oh, this is the thing. I think when you listen to some of the witchcraft stories, I mean, my favorite's always the Isabel Gowdy one, when she gives the charm where you can raise a storm and make it rain with like a rag and a stick. Yeah. And I must admit, with the weather we've had lately, I was kind of like, should I give that a go? Because we could really use some rain. So it is quite interesting how these things kind of travel.
Yeah, and this was a while ago, a long time ago, not long ago, but when I was still doing Navajo studies. But we were the New Mexico area where Sunny lived was really dry, and I said, well, we've just got tons of rain, and she was like, take a dish rag and put it outside the next time it rains, and then put it in a bag and bring it with you, and because we were going to be out there in a couple of weeks, and she was like, and then when you get here, wring it out. And so, to make it right, bring your rain here. And I did it. And then it did rain. It was crazy. But I'm in Gallup, New Mexico, out on the balcony of my hotel, wringing out this wet rag.
I'm just thinking, imagine if you flew trying to explain that to customs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that was, yeah. So I checked it in my luggage.
Oh, I don't know if you've ever heard this song. It's oh God, it's like vintage 90s cheese. But there was one by, I think it was Crowded House, and it had the line like, everywhere you go, always take the weather with you. And I'm like, wow, that song has a whole different meaning now.
Yeah.
So do you find then with I don't know obviously if the archives had this, but you've got obviously witches going around doing their witchy stuff. Did you also have like the corresponding like folk magic that ordinary people would then do, which never gets considered as witchcraft? Did people have their own things that they did?
You mean like everyday magic, generally in Appalachia you have it two things, either weather stuff or like cures, warts were a big one. If you have a wart, you rub raw meat on the wart and then bury the meat, and then when the meat kind of deteriorates, your warts will go away. So the dish rag figures that steal a dish rag and rub that on your warts and then burn it or something like that. But so there was that kind of stuff. But then like with weather stuff, like mostly like with rain, the idea of killing a black snake and then throwing the dead body over the snake's body over a fence post, and that would supposedly bring rain. There was that kind of magic. Lots of, but also there were lots of ideas about like charms to obviously ward off witchcraft, protective charms. One of the big ones in Appalachia that we have is it's called we have these silver dimes, and they don't make them anymore. These were like from the early 1900s, but you can get them at a coin store. But they're called Liberty dimes, and I think they're almost like 98% silver. And so you drill a hole in one of those and run a string through it, and then wear it as a magical charm. And so that was like, that'll ward off anything, bad luck, protect you while you travel, protect you from witchcraft, you name it. But it's also like one of the most intimate gifts that you can give someone. And I thought this was sweet. You give that to someone, and that's sort of almost like a promise that you will protect them too. That's like just in the process of giving that gift, that you'll always be present, that your intent is to always protect them from harm. And it becomes like it's a very intimate gift to give someone, as almost like as a promise to always be there, at least in spirit. And if you can't be physically, at least in spirit, you will still be there with them. And that goes back to that idea of hauntology, to give someone that you do almost become like a ghost. That act of giving becomes something that seeps through that porous idea of time to be always present. So, and I thought that was a nice idea. But this is the one that I like. So because I thought about this, so in my entire life I've grown up, and I know lots of other people have this tradition too. But on New Year's Day, you eat sauerkraut and sausage, and that is supposed to bring you good luck and money for the rest of the year. And so that's just one of those things that I've always, my parents made me do it. I still do it. Even when I was in grad school and didn't have any money, I would have sauerkraut and hot dogs, on New Year's Day to keep that going. And it didn't really occur. So again, because I'm kind of in that mode, one particular, I have it written down exactly how they phrased it. Somebody had written or had told Roberts, cook cabbage on New Year's Day for luck, and you will have green money the entire year. And the minute that I read it that way, it's like that sympathetic magic, the cabbage is green, and so that becomes money, and then you ingest it, and you do it with this intent, and that's very practical magic, because then you have, on that very first day of the year, you have thought about, performed a ritual, set a spell almost, have that green money all year long, and then you eat it, and then that's going to keep your intention focused on those moments where you can, have that green money. Look, kind of always keep your eyes open for those opportunities. And I thought, if that was, you tell somebody that I eat, in my area of Appalachia, we always eat cabbage on New Year's Day, and everybody's like, "Oh, you guys are so superstitious." But if that was an Egyptian charm, you would have people lined up around the block to get a hold of that and study it and really scrutinize it. But it's the same thing. It's this incredible idea of the sympathetic magic of finding these correspondences of like what things look like. Like we have the buckeye. It's like a little nut, and you can't eat it. I don't know. I used to have one in here, but it looks like a deer's eye. And so the old times, people used to cut holes in their coat and stitch it into their coat. The idea being, because a deer will always see you coming and run away, that this thing keeps an eye out for you, and it's a good luck charm. So, but they have to look like, but it's this idea of like semiotic correspondence and sympathetic magic. But a lot of, almost the entirety of Appalachian everyday magic is sympathetic magic. It's like finding something that looks like something or smells like something, reminds you of something, and then performing some kind of ritual about that. And that was always the thing too, with even with witches, the making of hairballs. Protect your hairbrushes, because a witch will come in and take the hair and make this charm and then witch you with it by, because it's your hair or your article of clothing. And they take the hair, that's part of you, and then they can witch you for that. But even to not loan a stranger money, because even money can, if you loan someone a stranger money, that stranger could be a witch, and they will use your money to turn some kind of spell around on you. So this idea that, so again, this idea of sympathetic magic and clothes magic, witches stealing stuff off clotheslines, stealing your clothes off clotheslines to use it as a means to witch a person. So yeah, lots of really interesting sympathetic magic in Appalachia.
So would you say there's a fair bit of law that kind of deals with sort of how to ward things off in general? Like, is there a lot of protective stuff, or is it mostly just for witches?
To protect you from, there are lots of like magical charms that that people can make. Alex is my daughter, Alex, she's big on making witch bottles, and those are big in Appalachia, right? So, and I know that and you guys have those too, so I think probably that's one of the things that came over from Africa. I mean, this is still, we're still talking about witches, but from Africa we have this thing. So if you go into Appalachia, people will have like bottles stuck in trees, and that's from Africa. The idea that ghosts and witches will get stuck up in the bottles and get trapped. So we have these bottle trees. My front porch is painted haint blue, and this is a haint haunt, and in Appalachia we say haint. So you have this haint blue because witches and ghosts can't cross water. So you paint your porches this particular color of blue, and that'll keep things from, icky things from getting in your house. So yeah, so there is that, but mostly there's, I don't know if and you could, maybe you could even shed some light on this. There isn't this idea so much of like, so for every day, it's more about like keeping your eye out for signs. Like we're big on signs. So, if the fire burns slowly, that means bad weather is approaching. So a lot of this stuff is based on knowing when that the world is, that the world that we live in is very structured and predictable if you know what you're looking at. And so it's being smart enough and thoughtful enough and engaged enough. And again, this is a very Appalachian idea, to be engaged with your surroundings enough so that you can say, oh, well, that bird did this, therefore such and such will happen. And I talked about this in Berea too, because it sets up this kind of causation, but it really isn't it's not that the bird is going to cause, a death in the family, or it's not that the dreaming about lightning means you're going to get struck by lightning, right? They're not cause and effect, but it says, here's something that you should be aware of. And so in Appalachia, there's a kind of magical thinking, but it's very practical in terms of like looking for signs, always being like, well, what does that mean? And my dad is big on that. My dad will say, it's like, oh, well, I don't know, the birds are flying this way, so that means it's going to be fair weather, and that kind of stuff. So, and then you can, and planting by the signs is another one. And we've talked about that, right? So always, putting yourself into, it goes back to that idea of time that I was talking about before. So the number one magical thing an Appalachian can do is to put yourself into the rhythm of nature, and so that you are always in sync with it. Because that's the other thing, like, well, was it the dream of fruit out of season, have trouble out of reason, right? So it's like, so you have these dreams that remind you that you're kind of getting out of sync with what you should be doing, or the proper way of behaving given this big context that we're in. So yeah, so in Appalachian sport, it's intentional magic, but it's aware, it's an awareness. So you're not really working, so the magic is not working it, the magic is putting yourself in sync with this already vast magical metaphysics that's at work all around us. And there's an Appalachian poet, Morris Manning, and he talks about the idea of like he was trying to explain that concept. And he went to Europe, and he went into one of these big cathedrals, and they had this organ that was an entire room. And he walks in while they're playing the organ. He realized that he was part of the organ, right? That the music, how it beats down on him as he stood in the middle. And it was like, that's what it's like to be, an Appalachian, is that you're not the master of the earth, right? You're not somehow separate from the earth, that you're a natural part of the environment. And to start to recognize, and when you recognize that, then you can, you can work it to your advantage. those enterprises of life that are good. You'll have better crops. You'll be able to feed your family. You won't get stuck in a downpour and get washed away by a flood because you knew this or that sign. So it's very, so I guess it might seem magical on the outside, but to an Appalachian, it's like, no, I just understood what that meant.
Mm. Yeah, I guess in some ways it's asking you to just be a bit more observant.
Yeah, and and again, where do you, and it goes back to what we were talking before. It's like, where do you learn that stuff from, right? You learn that from the old people. That's the idea of the old wives' tale, right? It was like, well, I learned that from an old wife, and they got to be old because they knew this stuff, right? So that becomes really valuable information to have.
Yeah, and I think this is where it's also quite interesting because I know obviously I've done quite a lot of workshops and so on with Amaya, who obviously I interviewed last year, and she's quite big on people sort of getting into community with the natural environment as
Mm,
well. So it's not like an extractive thing of, oh, what can I get out of it?
yeah.
But it's sort of like, what can I put into it as well? And I think that that's something that a lot of this, I guess, sort of sympathetic magic in a way sort of almost does as well. It plugs you into, the fact that you are still like, and I think humans forget this, we are still part of sort of this like wider sort of ecosystem, and we're in that as well. It's just unfortunately we leave a little bit more of a bigger footprint than others. And it's like I started planting by signs because Amaya taught me how. And I mean, honestly, my wildflowers are going wild literally in the back garden. I mean, my basil plant that I shared the photo of on my basil uh, post, I mean, that's just insane. And it's wonderful having that kind of thing of, oh, that was just a really simple thing to do, to just pay attention to when I did something rather than like sitting scrolling on my phone all the time. And I mean,
Hmm.
because there's a time and a place for doom scrolling, but I think there is something quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite, I don't want to say beneficial, but there is something almost therapeutic about sort of getting into the rhythms of your local area. I mean, I noticed this with our first lockdown in March 2020, which feels like it was years and years ago now, but because I couldn't leave where I live, like I couldn't leave the area. I just used to go on sort of walks every day. And I started charting the development of the flower. So it was like, oh, that tree's in blossom, and then oh, the hawthorn's about to blossom. And obviously because there's loads of folklore associated with the plants, I wanted to check if it still worked. Bearing in mind a lot of it was gathered in like the 19th century. So I was like, is the time of year still right? And of course, no, it's not for where I am because I'm a lot further north than a lot of the law was collected, but it was a nice way for me to engage with where I live, by kind of checking if the folklore was still true. And then suddenly being like, wow, I didn't know this many plants grew in my area or in my garden. I didn't plant that. Where did that come from? So it was a nice way to feel that little bit more rootedness, I think, with where I am. And I sort of feel like that's something that perhaps as useful as technology is, because obviously this wouldn't be happening without technology.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? I mean, we could try carry a pigeon, but it might take a while. But at the same time, I do think that tech is kind of almost the antithesis of folklore because while it helps us connect over vast differences, it helps us disconnect locally, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, because because you get, well, so two things that, like, in March of 2022, really weird things happened too. Like, on the one hand, like you said, we have a little forest across at the end of our street. We live in town, like this. Oberlin is a small little town. So, but that was like the one thing that we did every day. We would all go, because like you said, we couldn't go anywhere, so we'd go walk through the woods every day. And I guess for me, this is me being snobby, but it's like, well, that's not the woods like down home. It's like, it's just this little tiny, probably like 10-acre, stretch of woods. Like, that's not the Hocking Hills. And so I was snotty about it. But once you start to get into it, um, then it's like those become your woods, and like you said, you kind of get a sense of the turn of the seasons and what grows in there. And so, Alex and my son James and I, we spent a lot of time over there, like identifying plants, like you said, and it's like, oh, and then Alex has this binder now. It's like, well, this plant will do this, and this plant will do this, and so, and that was something that we really learned about where we were, about like what the trees were, what kind of plants grew there, what was in the creek, and all of that. but then too, like you said, but then there was the technology aspect. I got to do all those cool things with you guys in the UK, and nobody does folklore like you guys in the UK. So that was like a hoot for me, because it's just like, so I could go spend time in my woods and then come back here and sit and, like, attend, about, Newcastle folklore, or, you did that great presentation on Northumbria. I mean, so that was fun. So yeah, technology is great, but we can't let that become like something that causes us to disconnect from our physical environment. Like you said, I really do believe that. I mean, I don't think it's woo woo to say it, like, that human beings, we're part of this, that we're natural beings. We're not, and I think maybe we forget that. It's like, no, I'm really part of this. I'm breathing this air, and I'm part of, like, breathing out carbon dioxide, all that stuff, and I even, like, when we were kids in school, we would learn about, like, the water cycle, and we would learn about, carbon dioxide, the trees breathe oxygen, and they breathe our carbon dioxide, and there's this weird, this, how we're all related to each other. And you kind of, you would leave, in here in in America, you'd leave sixth grade like really feeling like, well, I'm centered in this, right? I'm part of this. It's not, I am not the master of this. I am, the tree needs me, and I need that tree, you know. And I think that somehow we've lost that. It's like, well, technology can fix it. Well, Elon Musk will fix it, or whoever, money, we'll throw money at it and it'll be fine. But I just, as opposed to changing our behavior to be more in tune with where we're at. It's like, I don't know, like, living up here, I live up in the snow, we call it the snow belt. And so where I grew up, we had perpetual ice storms, but not a lot of snow. And if we got 3 inches of snow, that would shut a county down, and nobody went anywhere until the snow was gone. But up here, they get 3 feet, and everybody's like, ah. It's like, and it terrifies me. It's like, I can't go to the grocery store. It's snowing outside.
Yeah, I'm just laughing because in the UK, it's like we get a quarter of an inch of snow. We're like, oh my God, what are we going to do? But yeah, when we had the beast from the east a few years ago, that was really something, because that was proper snow. Because the snow we tend to get, it never really quite gets cold enough, so it kind of tends to fall like slush, and it looked beautiful for about 10 minutes, and then it all kind of goes to hell from there, which is really annoying if you're someone like me who loves snow. But it was quite interesting what we're saying about technology, because obviously I was chatting to my PhD supervisor last week, and he sort of said something really interesting. He said, wouldn't you think, with all this technology and all, like, the internet and everything, that more people would have, like, proof of ghosts? And I was like, yeah. I mean, I think part of the problem is, when people share an image on Twitter, everyone immediately is like Photoshop. Like, that's people's, because it's so easy to do. And I think it is quite interesting how, in a way, it's almost like technology's become a really good way to disseminate folklore, but it's actually, you'd think it would help us capture evidence of stuff, but it doesn't seem to. So I was sort of thinking that it's almost like, what happened to like actual ghost sightings? I mean, because I don't know if it's just a bit of Twitter that I hang out in it. So, but basically, yeah, so people, like, they listen to one can either talk about the show, so people talk about other people's ghost experiences. And, some people will talk about theirs, but then you do think, well, why hasn't tech beyond EVPs, I think, really been able to capture these sort of things? And they still remain, and I quite like this actually, they still remain in that realm of a story that we tell each other. And we'll tell what happened, and we'll talk about our experience. But I almost quite like the fact that it kind of defies technology.
Yeah, no, I love that idea too. And that's why, because again, it's the idea of storytelling as being something that you participate in, and then it becomes like your experience becomes a part of you. So yeah, I like that idea too, that where somebody will say, like, well, I saw Bigfoot and I took a picture, but then when I looked, Bigfoot wasn't in the picture. Again, it's like, well, that doesn't mean that person didn't see Bigfoot, because the experience is the story. And I think there's a great, have you seen the documentary or the docu-series Hellier? Have you seen that? It's an American, it's independent. I think you can still get it on Amazon, but it's absolutely worth it. They go looking for goblins, and it's the Greg Newkirk is the guy. I can't remember what his wife's name is, but they're a young couple, but but anyway, but the whole point is they don't find any goblins, and so then people got mad, like, well, you spent this, two seasons and you never found a goblin. But it was the experience of going through this sort of first person mystery of them looking for the goblins, and they took you along for that ride. You became part of their story, and you should watch that, Icy. I think you'd find that fascinating because it's set in Appalachia too. So that was like my first thing. But there are all of these clues that they're trying to put together, and you're along for the ride. And it's like that's the joy of Hellier. Not oh my God, they found goblins, and so now goblins are real. It's just that it was that experience of going through that, and again, opening up your mind to these different possibilities, or just being able to, for a minute, to entertain the possibility that, whoa, there might be a goblin in that cave, or, oh, all those balloons mean something, but I think, like you said, I think that for me, that's the fun. I think technology, I like that the phenomena does not like technology either.
Well, I know, because when I asked you about Appalachian ghost stories, you said there's a very specific thing that you get with them that you don't really get with them, like, because obviously, but if you look at like the way the UK ghost story kind of evolves, and there's a fabulous book, Susan Owen's The Ghost Cultural History, or obviously Roger Clark's book on the natural history of ghosts, explain kind of how our stories evolve. But there's often, like, towards the end, kind of a sense of like a retribution, sort of got to lay them to rest, kind of like cinematic feel to them. But I think you were sort of telling me earlier that there's not that in your ghost stories.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I was, because I went in with the intention of, right, to Berea College, and like, I'm going to dig through all these ghost stories, and I'm going to find these ghosts, and they're going to, and that's going to be my, that's how I'm going to figure out hauntology, but yeah, it's like so like, for the ghost story, Old Man Wilson's ghost. Old Man Wilson is this poor old guy, and he steals some food, he gets caught, and they hang him, and then his ghost haunts the place where he was hung. And so people just like, so we just avoid that spot in the road. And it's like, like, okay. Or there was the guy who there's this implication that there's this guy, he's married, and he might have murdered his wife, right? And so, but then he marries again, and his new wife is pregnant, and she goes into labor, so he goes to get the midwife. And so him and the midwife are riding down the road, and he sees his first wife, the ghost of his first wife, coming up the road, and they kind of pass each other. And then he's like, well, can I spend the night with the midwife, because I'm afraid to go out after dark because my dead wife is walking out. It's like, well, that doesn't really, there was no, like you said, there's no like putting it to rest there. And it's always good when you do research and it surprises you. And that really did surprise me. I was very surprised that there wasn't that, because if the ghost is going to remind you of your almost blunted purpose, right, then you should do something. Hamlet eventually does something. It'd be like if the ghost said that, Hamlet's just like, well, that's the last time I go up on that part of the castle, and the end of play. A very short play. So yeah, so that I did find that was fascinating. And what that said to me, if I was going to do a takeaway on that, is that as important as the past is, there's only a limit to, it really does come down to our choice. What are you going to do with that? And it seems to be sort of not seeing the past as being, it's important, but not as important as the present or the future. And because that's where you find, and I guess it's because the past has already happened. There's not much you can do about it, the past, but there is something you can do about the present and the future. So that was so this idea of an Appalachian hauntology, to go back to where we started, it's not just backward looking, but it's also really looking at the way that the past sort of interferes with the present, but also the way the future interferes with the present, and the way the present will interfere with itself. And so you have, for the future, you have premonitions, and so then you're able to sort of make a choice based on that. And then in the present, you have lies, and being able to and like trickster figures, and they open up a lie. A good lie will open up the possibility for you to do something different. And again, it's all about focusing that intent and that purpose. but yeah, but the idea that our ghost stories were just kind of lame, because they all kind of got that point. It's like, this horrible thing happened, there's a ghost, so let's just don't go there anymore. you know
I quite like that though, because when you look at, like, when you go to a tourist site or a heritage site and they've got a guidebook, and then they'd be like, oh, in this particular gallery, the grey lady ghost has been seen and she walks up and down. Right?
yeah.
And me being me, I'm like, well, let's go and see the grey lady then, shall we? And I think there is something kind of, it's almost like the touristification of ghost stories in a way that you don't want there to be a resolution, because you need people to keep coming back to see the ghost. So I quite like the fact that, like, there is that sort of, like, it just becomes like part of the background radiation of the space of like, yep, there's ghosts. And I quite like that, because you think, well, it's like, I know the other day I was tweeting about how I was watching this program on black holes, and they were admitting there's so much they don't know about them. And I'm like, well, if there's so much that, like, actual astrophysicists don't know about the way reality works, can we really say the ghosts aren't a thing?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I like the idea too. Like you said, I like the idea of ghosts as being background radiation, because I mean, I don't know if they're, I don't know if I believe in a ghost like, Dickens, like, rattling chains and things, but I like the idea of, and again, going back to Hookland and the idea of and David Southwell's idea of, like, of ghost soil. I like the idea that there is, even if it's not something physical, it's something psychic, and it's in memory, and you get, like, psychogeography and all of that kind of stuff. I really think that there is something to that. And I'll tell you, I'll tell you my Navajo ghost story. So there's a place in New Mexico called Chaco Canyon, and it's like the cliff dwellers, I think, is like the kind of like the popular thing, but it's a really, really old place. And there's a lot of Navajo folklore around Chaco Canyon, but I would go there a lot. So it's one of my favorite places to go. It still is. So I went up way on top of this mesa, this like kind of like flat mountain thing, and so you can look down and see all of the ruins laid out. So it was really early in the morning, and so I'm walking, through the bottom to get to where you climb up on top of the mesa, and I pass a tour group, and it's because it's early morning, so it's still cool. So that's when all the old people do their tours, down at the bottom before it gets hot. So I got myself to the top, and I'm up there, and I'm looking down over the of all of the ruins, and I'm taking some pictures. I was going to use them in class, and I start to and I hear, like, all of this shuffle coming up, and I'm like, oh man, here comes that tour group. And then I'm thinking, it's like, well, how in the hell did they get up here? Because it's a hard climb. It's like straight up. So a little annoyed that my solitude is going to be broken, and so I waited, and it got closer and closer and closer. So I moved off the trail and got a little closer to the edge, so I could let them pass. And then there's that moment where, like, the atmosphere changes, like when people, like, when a big group of people come, and you can kind of feel that movement, like their bodies and their body heat and everything. So I thought, okay, well, I shouldn't be a jerk. I should at least acknowledge them, So I turn around, and there's nobody there. And then I hear this sound, and it goes, it's like all the way past me, and then it's gone. And I was freaked out. And so I got down off, and I went back to and so on the way out, the bathrooms are in the like the visitor center. So went to the bathroom, and then I went in. I was going to buy some books. There's a little Navajo lady park ranger who was working at the desk, and so I'm checking out my books, and I said, man, I said, the wind plays funny up on top of South Mesa, doesn't it? And she looked at me. She's like, what do you mean? And I said, I swear, I said, I was up there, and I thought I heard voices. And she looked at me, and she goes, I wouldn't tell too many people about that.
Oh, wow. Is there a story associated with the area?
Most archaeologists think that it was like it was a ritual center, kind of like so probably more related to the Pueblo people that are all over the place. So it's kind of like a central place where they would kind of come together to have like a big festival, because they know, I always tell my students, it's like a college or a university, that they know that, like, by going through the trash that probably like maybe 100 people would live there at a time, but then it would swell to thousands for like a short period of time, and then it would all go away. So there was obviously like a group of priests or academicians or whatever who lived there, but then it kind of grew. But the Navajo have this story where it starts off the same way, that that it was this place of great power and great learning, and then this they call him the gambler. He shows up and he gets everybody hooked on gambling, and depending on the different stories, sometimes there's a narcotic gum involved, so like drugs and gambling and sports, and he kind of completely destroys this great center. So, and it gets so bad that the gambler offends the son, and so the son then picks this champion who in the Navajo stories is a young Navajo guy, and he goes in and challenges the gambler to all these games, and the animals help him cheat, because the gambler possesses some kind of magic. He has a magic charm where he can't lose, and so there's like a game where you have to push this pole over, and so the hero is pushing the pole, and he gets it bent over, and so then when the gambler goes to push it, there's a rabbit or a gopher who keeps pushing the pole back up. So, but eventually he wins, and they shoot the gambler into space with this giant bow. And so the story is the gambler is always looking for light, so he gets shot into the darkness, so he's always looking for light so he can come back. And so there's this it's a really cool story. Paul Zolbrod has like I don't know, kind of like the most comprehensive version in his book called the Dene Bahane, which is the Navajo creation story, but it's called the Gambler Legend.
I always just think it's really interesting, sort of thinking how these stories almost become associated with places as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Well, that's what we were saying too, like with the ghost stories. I mean, you can, where somebody was murdered. Every community has a witch grave, right? I mean, at least here, that's one of the big things. Where the haunted houses are. And we going back to that idea of variance, these stories become hyper localized, and I think and again that becomes a sense of community identity. It becomes a local knowledge. Anthropologists are big on local knowledge, and I think a lot of that local knowledge is tied up in these heavily coded metaphysical stories, because and which is what makes not to get I don't want to get too far into this, but that's what makes it so interesting. Like with our culture, with sort of European cultures, because they like Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion then that kind of gets brought in, and then kind of took away a lot of those or supplanted a lot of stuff. So then you get into this weird like accumulated occult layers. It's like, well, this Catholic church, and such is built on top of of an old druid religious well or something, and so that's an interesting metaphor, but it does show like how like sometimes I think that we have been because again like I know a lot of people that are religious, but that's their idea. It's like, well, I want to be in Bethlehem for Christmas, because that's where it happened, or I want to be in Jerusalem for Easter, but we don't, but kind of lose track of how important the place, why we're talking about going through the woods and stuff during the pandemic, lose track of how important those stories about where we're actually at the moment. The town that I'm from, or the town that I grew up in, we have a pumpkin show in the fall, the third Wednesday of every October, and that is such an important like beacon to pull everybody home for 3 days or 3 or 4 days in October, and everybody comes home, and it's a big deal, and so that becomes that's sort of, so in a way I think we should, folklore festivals, localized stories. This is a way that we start to becomes one way we start to identify ourselves back to place, and that's one of the things that I really like about your work, is that you are so place centered. It's like you, in my mind, you are synonymous now with Newcastle upon Tyne. It's like I can't, and when I come across like something, and I'm reading a folklore book and I come across, I'm just like, ooh, icy, this is icy country, the vampire rabbit or whatever, and I think that we all have that opportunity. We all have that opportunity to get to know our places better through festivals and weird architecture and all that kind of stuff. Like, here in Oberlin, we have a one of the college buildings was made by the same architect who built the Ohio the prison where they filmed like the Shawshank Redemption and stuff, and once you know that, it's like, oh, ick, because this fantastic Harry Potter looking castle suddenly looks, oh my god, it looks just like the Reformatory. They're right. So
That makes me laugh because the building where I teach has actually doubled for a prison before on TV. Well, the inside has, yeah.
That's funny. We have a new building. I'll never forget this. At Robert Morris University, where I teach, we had just had this new building built, and the first year that it opened, we had all moved in. Everybody was very proud of the building, but I had a student who was Russian, and she came into my office one day and she said, who was it that decided to build this to look like a Russian prison? And I was like, what? And so she's like pointing out, it's like, well, this is the commons area, and this is where the guards walk, and all of the offices are the cells. And I'm like, ew.
I must admit, I'm quite pleased to hear that sort of like you've got me synonymous with Newcastle, because there's some people that I know in the US where their picture of Newcastle is like me and John Constantine and Hellblazer. So it's kind of a really, like interesting sort of weird mix between the two, which is nice. But I think obviously because where I am, I mean, we've obviously had, because I'm technically where I live is like north of the wall, so this is obviously like would have been Brigante country way back when Hadrian first turned up, and then you've obviously got all the the border reavers, you've got the Vikings, and all that kind of thing, and then of course you move forward into the Industrial Revolution, and we're all like shipbuilding and so on, and like coming up with the railways and stuff. So we've got this weird kind of like, sticking it to the Romans plus technical innovation sort of thing going on. So it is, and then of course you've got all this weird folklore and like genius loci on the side of the civic center, and it is a kind of, I think you couldn't really be here and not have some kind of interest in the weirder side of history. And that's where when I've been doing like the talks at the cathedral, it's been because the cathedral's such a heritage site, and it's like, but then how does that then link in with sort of stories and place and everything as well? So I think it is, folklore becomes like almost like, I don't want to call it a gateway drug, but it's kind of like a portal into so many other aspects of things that probably sound a bit highfalutin and a bit academic in a way, because you can just also think it's interesting.
Yeah.
But I think that if you do feel that you have to justify it to people, because let's be honest, there's always someone going, what's the point? I think there are all these things that it ultimately comes down to what makes us human.
Yeah, and I grew up so Ross County, Ohio, where I was born. We have the mound builders, so which is this these mysterious Native Americans that were there before, like even like the Shawnee or the the Cherokee and all of that. And so that was like the mystery that I grew up with, was like, who were these people? And then every old guy was an expert on mound lore. Like they could tell you what those mounds were used for, and they were and every answer was different. And so it was this highly speculative game, but that was the ghost, right? These were the ghosts that connected us. These ghosts brought a mystery that really centered you in Ross County. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. I mean, to have those to be in tune with the mysteries of where you are gives, it really opens up for some significant imaginative thought. It gives purpose. I mean, because it's funny, like you said, there's always going to be that person who asks, like, so what's the point? But then that's the same person that thinks that that there are satanic whatevers with space lasers. I mean, so a lot of the conspiracy theories that people do now is that's just folklore with technology. And because like I said before, I don't think there's that part of our brain that will not stay idle. And if we're not engaged in the real mysteries that are around us, then we'll make something up. Because otherwise life is pointless, I think.
On that note. No, I think it is really interesting. I think the one thing that I really like about the work that you did at the archives is actually getting to look at archival material.
Mm,
And I know obviously that's where it's really cool what Mark Norman's doing with the Folklore Library and Archive,
yes.
because it's that preservation. And I know, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the Duchess.ie website where there's like someone went out and collected lots of Irish folklore,
Mm,
and just tales as well, and all kinds of really cool first-hand accounts. And I think that's something that it's quite nice to read those sort of first-hand accounts, because in a way it's almost like, well, you can read books about folklore, you can listen to podcasts about folklore, but sometimes it is quite nice just to, if you can't like ask people that you know about it, it's always quite nice to know that what somebody said has actually been preserved, which I'll periodically do on Twitter, because I'll be like, right, so everyone tell me this thing about, like, when I asked about people's flying superstitions, and they kind of fell into like 4 camps. And it's like, oh wow, so yeah, quite a lot of people thought that they had this really individual superstition, but it was actually quite a lot of people practiced the same thing. And I'm like, as someone who hates flying, I'm right there with you, So it was kind of, again, it is that sort of, where are our common similarities rather than where are our differences.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it's worth asking the question of people. Just, if you have older people in your life, asking them, what they remember of things. And then obviously if it's just, it's a better question than what you've been watching on Netflix,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
asking people sort of like, what they think about things, or if they've ever heard any weird stories about something. I've heard urban legends about where I work, and I know some of them are just nonsense, but just because historically something doesn't make sense. But I just think it's quite a nice way to bond with people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a good currency to exchange. I mean, to swap stories
Mm,
is it's a really good, that's what we'll, that's what I love about being from Appalachia. One of the things is that we do, it's like, you never get away without a story, so it's, you meet somebody and they'll, who are your people, and then you get a really good story, a good back and forth of stories, and that's always fun. That's how you get to know each other.
mm. So I think that we should basically give everyone homework assignments, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we
Because
should.
that's what we get when a pair of teachers interview each other. It's that
Yeah.
idea of like, go out and find out some stories from people that you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and Leonard Roberts was big on that. That's why he would send his students home and say, bring back a story, and so, but yeah, otherwise the stuff just gets lost. And so I like the idea of us. I like the work that you do, and like, again, what Mark Norman is doing, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from you guys, because that's what I want to do too. It shouldn't just be, well, let's parse this and find out the mark, the phenomenological hauntology of this or that story. It's like, but let's really talk about, let's get them and look at them and see where they're at in the world. And that's why I like to look at literature. Eventually I like to, really dig into the folklore, and then look to see where those stories are still being told.
Mm. And yeah, and I think obviously if people actually are more interested in the actual just hearing the stories, there are so
Mm-hmm.
many excellent podcasts that do that. I mean, the Afro Tales podcast is a really good example of that. Amon does a really, really good job of kind of actually telling the tale. Or then obviously if you prefer British folklore, you've got like the fairy folk
Mm-hmm.
podcast and so on. So obviously if you just like having a tale well told, then there's plenty of ways to engage with folklore, sort of beyond me kind of poking holes in it.
There's a good one. I don't know if you've listened to it. It's called Great Lakes Lore, and it's like it's like in this area, but it's two historians, but one historian is very historian, and then Samantha Ingalls is the other folklorist, and she is, and she gets a little bit more like, well, we can poke holes in it, but then she's more on that side of like, well, what do those holes mean though? Right? What falls out of those holes once we poke them? And it's a really fascinating. They get into some really interesting conversations about, I mean, it starts off, usually mundane. Well, those are the secret society and blah blah blah. But then the way that they start, the way that both hosts really start to pick at it, it becomes like a fascinating way of looking at dissecting folklore. in Asheville, there's a great folklorist. Her name is Byron Ballard, and she does a lot of she calls it forensic folklore, where it's just like peeling back those accumulated layers and discussing how they communicate with each other. But she's a really good one too. She's got a podcast. Weird Mountain Gals, I think, is the name of hers.
Cool. Well, I think we've probably given people enough homework.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. We don't want to grade it anyway. So.
Obviously, like if anyone has any recommendations of other folklore-based podcasts, obviously on YouTube, they're more than welcome to put them in the comments, and that'll make a nice sort of collection of things for people to check out. Because I think that's the thing with sort of podcasts, because obviously you can listen to more than one of them, so obviously you can have hundreds. I don't even know how many I'm subscribed to now, but there's sort of a podcast for every mood, as it were.
Yes.
But I think we'll have to stop there, because otherwise, I mean, we could just talk for hours.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you very much for coming on Fabulous Folklore. I do obviously appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you, Icy, and thank you for everything that you do. I appreciate this. This was fun.
Yay! I enjoyed it as well. I think that hopefully comes across. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.